John Reginald Halliday Christie, nicknamed Reg, was an English serial unaliver and alleged necrophiliac active during 1940 and 1950. He unalived at least 8 people, including his wife, by strangling them inside his flat at 10 Rillington Place, Notting Hill, London. 3 of the bodies of his victims were found in a wallpaper-covered kitchen alcove soon after he moved out of Rillington Place during March 1953. The remains of 2 more victims were discovered in the garden, and his wife's body was found beneath the floorboards in the front room. Christie was arrested and convicted of his wife's unaliving, for which he was hanged. 2 of Christie's victims were Beryl Evans and her baby daughter Geraldine, who along with Beryl's husband Timothy Evans were the tenants at 10 Rillington Place during 1948 to 1949. This case sparked huge controversy after Evans was hanged for both unalivings. Evans was charged with both unalivings and found guilty of the unaliving of his daughter and hanged in 1950. Christie was a major prosecution witness, and his own crimes were discovered 3 years later. Serious doubts were raised about the integrity of Evans' conviction. Christie himself subsequently admitted unaliving Beryl but not Geraldine. It is now generally accepted that Christie unalived both victims and that police mishandling of the original inquiry allowed Christie to escape detection and enabled him to commit a further 4 unalivings. In 2004, the High Court acknowledged that Evans did not unalive either his wife or his child. John Christie was born on the 8th of April 1899 in Northampton near Halifax in the West Riding of Yorkshire, the 6th in the family of 7 children. He had a troubled relationship with his father, carpet designer Ernest John Christie, an austere and uncommunicative man who displayed little emotion towards his children and would punish them for trivial offences. John was also alternatively coddled and bullied by his mother and older sisters. On the 24th of March 1911, Christie's grandfather, David Halliday, passed away aged 75 in Christie's house after long illness. Christie later said that seeing his grandfather's body laid out on a trestle table gave him a feeling of power and well-being. A man he had once feared was now only a corpse. At the age of 11, Christie won a scholarship to Halifax Secondary School, where his favourite subject was maths, particularly algebra. He was also good at history and woodwork. It was later found that Christie had an IQ of 128. He also attended Boothtown Council School, also known as Boothtown Board School in Northampton. Christie sang in the church choir and was a scout. After leaving school on the 22nd of April 1913, he entered employment as an assistant projectionist. During his later life, Christie's childhood peers described him as a queer lad who kept himself to himself and was not very popular. In September 1916, during the First World War, Christie enlisted in the British Army. He was called up on the 12th of April 1917 to join the 52nd Northamptonshire and Derbyshire Regiment to serve as an infantryman. In April 1918, the regiment was dispatched to France, where Christie was seconded to the Duke of Wellington's regiment as a signalman. During the following June, Christie was injured in a mustard gas attack and spent a month in the military hospital in Calais. He later claimed that this attack had rendered him blind and mute for 3.5 years, and permanently impacted his ability to speak loudly. Ludovic Kennedy wrote that no record of Christie's blindness had been traced, and that, while he might have lost his voice when he was admitted to hospital, he would not have been discharged as fit for duty if he remained a mute. His inability to talk loudly, Kennedy argued, was a psychological reaction to the gassing rather than a lasting toxic effect of the gas. The reaction, and Christie's exaggeration of the effects of the attack, stemmed from an underlying historic personality disorder that caused him to exaggerate or feign illness as a ploy to get attention and sympathy. Christie was demobilised from the army on the 22nd of October 1919. He joined the Royal Air Force on the 13th of December 1923, but was discharged on the 15th of August 1924. Christie married Ethel Simpson from Bradford at Halifax Town's Register Office on the 10th of May 1920. His impotence remained, and he continued to visit women. Early in the marriage, his wife suffered a miscarriage. After 4 years of marriage, the couple separated. His wife worked at the Garside Engineering Co. on Ironbridge Road in Bradford, and he later worked at the English Electrical Co. on Thornton Road, also in Bradford, until 1928. That year, his wife and her siblings moved to Sheffield. In 1923, Christie moved to London. He spent the next decade in and out of prison, while his wife remained in Yorkshire with her relatives. He was released from prison in January 1934, and the couple reunited and moved into 10 Rillington Place. Christie began working as a postman on the 10th of January 1921 in Halifax, and his first conviction was for stealing postal orders on the 20th of February and 26th of March, for which he received 3 months imprisonment on the 12th of April 1921. He served his sentence at HM Prison, Manchester, and was released on the 27th of June. Christie was then convicted on the 15th of January 1923 for obtaining money on false pretences and of violent conduct, for which, respectively, he was bound over and placed on probation for 12 months. He committed 2 further crimes of larceny during 1924 and received consecutive sentences of 3 and 6 months imprisonment on the 22nd of September 1924 in HM Prison, Wandsworth. On the 13th of May 1929, after working for over 2 years as a lorry driver, Christie was convicted for assaulting Maud Cole, with whom he was living at 6 Olmec Road in Battersea, and was sentenced to 6 months hard labour. He had hit Cole over the head with a cricket bat, which the magistrate described as a murderous attack, for which he was again sentenced to HM Prison, Wandsworth. Finally, Christie was convicted of auto theft and was re-imprisoned at HM Wandsworth for 3 months on the 1st of November 1933. Christie and his wife reconciled in 1934 after he was released from prison, but he continued to visit women. He ended his recourse to petty crime. In 1937, the Christies moved into the top floor flat of 10 Rillington Place in Notting Hill. Then, a rather down area of London, they later moved into the ground floor flat in December 1938. The house was a 3-storey brick-end terrace, built in the 1870s during a period of intensive speculative building in the area, resulting in much jerry-built property which declined into poorly maintained and unimproved multi-occupancy rentals. The ground was of a common design. The ground and first floors each contained a bedroom and living room, with a kitchen scullery in the adjacent extension. But the second floor flat had 2 rooms only, a kitchen/living room and a bedroom. Living conditions were squalid. The building's occupants shared one outside toilet and none of the flats had a bathroom. The street was close to an above-ground section of the London Underground's Metropolitan line, now the Hammersmith and City and Circle lines, and the train noise would be deafening for the occupants at 10 Rillington Place. After 3 years of working as a foreman at the Commodore Cinema in King Street, Hammersmith, at the beginning of the Second World War, Christie applied to join the War Reserve Police and was accepted. The authorities failed to check for the existence of a criminal record. He was assigned the Harrow Road Police Station, where he met a woman called Gladys Jones, with whom he began an affair. The relationship lasted until mid-1943, when the woman's husband, a serving soldier, returned from the war. After learning of the affair, he went to the house where his wife was living, discovered Christie there, and assaulted him. Christie committed his murders over a 10-year period between 1943 and 1953, usually by strangling his victims after he had rendered them unconscious with domestic gas, containing carbon dioxide, some of which he outwarded as they laid unconscious. The first person Christie admitted to killing was Ruth Furst, a 21-year-old Austrian munitions worker who supplemented her income by occasionally engaging in prostitution. Christie claimed to have met Furst when she was soliciting clients in a snack bar by Ladbroke Grove. According to his own statements, on the 24th of August 1943, he invited Furst to his home to engage. His wife was visiting relatives at the time. Afterward, Christie impulsively strangled her on his bed with a length of rope. He initially stowed Furst's body beneath the floorboards of his living room, then buried it in the back garden the following evening. Soon after this murder, at the end of 1943, Christie resigned as a special constable. His service index card is now on display at the Metropolitan Police Museum, whilst evidence from his murders now forms part of the Crime Museum collections. The following year, he found new employment as a clerk at Acton Radio Factory. There he met his second victim, colleague Muriel Amelia Adey. On the 7th of October 1944, he invited Edie back to his flat with a promise that he had concocted a special mixture that could cure her bronchitis. Edie was to inhale the mixture from a jar with a tube inserted at the top. The mixture was in fact Friar's balsam, which Christie used to disguise the smell of domestic gas. Once Edie was seated, breathing in the mixture from the tube, with her back turned, Christie inserted a second tube into the jar and connected it to a gas tap. As Edie continued breathing, she inhaled the domestic gas, which soon rendered her unconscious. Domestic gas during the 1940s was coal gas, which had a carbon monoxide content of 15%. Christie essayed her and strangled her before burying her alongside first. Timothy Evans was a native of Merthyr Tydfil in Glamorgan, Wales. His father Daniel abandoned the family in April 1924 before Evans's birth. Evans had an older sister, Eileen, born in 1921, and a younger half-sister, Maureen, who was born in September 1929. Evans' mother remarried in September 1933. As a child, Evans had difficulty learning to speak and struggled at school. Following an accident when he was 8, Evans developed a tubercular verruca on his right foot and never completely healed, and caused him to miss considerable amounts of time from school for treatment, further setting him back in his education. As a result, when he reached adulthood, Evans possessed low literacy skills, often needing others to read lengthy documents to him, although he did possess some ability to read some passages, such as in comics, newspapers, football reports, and on his wages and receipts. He liked boxing and football, supporting Queen's Park Rangers, as did Christie. He was also prone to inventing stories about himself to boost his self-esteem, a trait that continued into his adulthood and interfered with his efforts to establish credibility when dealing with the police and courts. In 1935, his mother and second husband moved to London, and Evans worked as a painter and decorator while attending school. He returned to Merthyr Tydfil in 1937 and briefly worked in the coal mines, but had to resign because of continuing problems with his foot. In 1939, he moved to London to live again with his mother, and in 1946 they moved to St Park's Road, Notting Hill. This was just over 2 minutes' walk from 10 Rillington Place, his further residence after he married. Evans was fined 60 shillings at West London Magistrates Court on the 25th of April 1946 for stealing a car and driving without insurance or a licence. On the 20th of January 1947, Evans married Beryl Susanna Thorley, whom he had met in January 1947 on a blind date. The couple initially lived with Evans's family at St Mark's Road, but after Beryl discovered she was pregnant in 1948, they moved into the top-floor flat at 10 Rillington Place. Their marriage was characterised by angry quarrels. Beryl was alleged to be a poor housekeeper and incapable of managing the family's finances, whilst Timothy misspent his wages on alcohol, and his heavy drinking at the time exacerbated his already short temper. The arguments between Timothy and Beryl were loud enough to be heard by neighbours, and physical violence between them was witnessed on several occasions. In 1949, Beryl revealed to Timothy that she was pregnant with her second child. Since the family was already struggling financially, Beryl decided to have an abortion. After some initial reluctance, Evans agreed to this course of action. During Easter of 1948, Timothy Evans and his wife Beryl moved into the top-floor flat at 10 Rillington Place, where Beryl gave birth that October to their daughter Geraldine. In late 1949, Evans informed the police that his wife was dead. A police search of the building failed to find her body, but a later search revealed the bodies of Beryl, Geraldine, and a 16-week male fetus in the outdoor washhouse. Beryl's body had been wrapped twice in a blanket and then a tablecloth. The post-mortem revealed that both mother and daughter had been strangled and that Beryl had been physically assaulted before her death, shown by facial bruising. Evans at first claimed that Christie had killed his wife in a botched abortion operation, but police questioning eventually produced a confession. The alleged confession may have been fabricated by the police, as the statement appears contrived and artificial. After being charged, Evans withdrew his confession and once again accused Christie, this time of both murders. On the 11th of January 1950, Evans was put to trial for the murder of his daughter, the prosecution having decided not to pursue a second charge for murdering his wife. Christie was a principal witness for the Crown. He denied Evans' accusations and gave detailed evidence about the quarrels between him and his wife. The jury found Evans guilty despite the revelation of Christie's criminal record of theft and violence. Evans was originally due to be hanged on the 31st of January, but appealed. After his appeal on the 20th of February had failed, Evans was hanged at HM Prison, Pentonville on the 9th of March 1950. At the time of Evans's trial, Christie had found a job at the Post Office Savings Bank on the 21st of May 1946 as a Grade 2 clerk and worked at Kew. He was sacked when his past criminal record came to light, leaving on the 4th of April 1950. Police made several mistakes in the handling of the Evanses case, especially in overlooking the remains of Christie's previous murder victims in the garden at 10 Rillington Place. One femur was later found propping up a fence. The garden of the property was very small, about 16 by 14 feet, and the fence was parallel to the wash house where the bodies of Beryl and Geraldine were later found. Several searches were made at the house after Evans confessed to placing his wife's remains in the drains, but 3 policemen conducting the search did not go into the washing house. The garden was apparently examined but not excavated at this point. Christie later admitted that his dog had unearthed Adie's skull in the garden shortly after the police searches. He threw the skull into an abandoned bombed-out house nearby in St. Mark's Road. There was clearly no systematic search of the crime scene, in which this or other human remains would have been found and pointed to Christie as the perpetrator. Several police searches of the property showed a complete lack of expertise in handling forensic evidence and were quite superficial at best. Had the searches been conducted effectively, the investigation would have exposed Christie as a murderer, and the lives of Evans and 4 women would have been saved. The evidence of builders working at Rillington Place was ignored, and their interviews with Evans suggested that the police conducted a fake confession. It would have been clear from the first statement made by Evans on the 30th of November 1949 that he did not know the resting place of the body of his wife, or know that she had been killed. He claimed that his wife's body was either in a manhole or a drain at the front of the house, but police search failed to find remains there. That should have prompted a thorough search of the residence, wash house and garden, but no further action was taken until when the 2 bodies were found in the wash house. Evans was also unaware in his first interview that his daughter had been killed. The police interrogation in London was mishandled from the start, when they showed him the clothes of his wife and baby and revealed that they had been found in the wash house. Such information should have been kept from him as to force him to tell the police where the bodies had been concealed. Several apparent confessions contain questionable words and phrases in high-register language, such as a terrific argument, which seem out of place for a distressed, uneducated, working-class young man such as Evans, and bear no relation to what he probably said. These were almost certainly inventions made later by the police, according to comments made by Ludovic Kennedy long after the truth about Christie had emerged. Police accepted all of Christie's statements as true without such scrutiny, as he was the crucial witness at the trial of Evans. As Kennedy wrote, the police accepted Christie, a former reserve policeman, as one of their own, largely taking what he said on face value without any further investigation. Bearing in mind that Christie had criminal convictions for theft and malicious wounding, while Evans had no convictions for violence, the reliance on his testimony was questionable. This is significant that Christie had claimed to be an abortionist prior to his meeting of the Evanses, having said so to a colleague in 1947. He also repeated this claim after Timothy Evans's trial to women he spoke to in cafes, whom he possibly regarded as potential victims. Such an approach aligns with Christie's modus operandi of offering help to women so as to gain their confidence and lure them into his flat, as demonstrated in Edie's case. Nearly 3 years passed without major incident for Christie after Evans's trial. He soon found other employment as a clerk with the British Road Services at their Shepherd's Bush depot, starting work there on the 12th of June 1950. At the same time, new tenants arrived to fill the vacant first and second floor rooms at 10 Rillington Place. The tenants were predominantly migrants from the West Indies. This horrified Christie and his wife, who both had racist views towards their neighbours and disliked living with them. Tensions between the new tenants and Christie's came to a head when his wife prosecuted one of the neighbours for assault. Christie negotiated with the Poor Man's Lawyer Centre to continue to have exclusive use of the back garden, ostensibly to have space between him and his neighbours, but quite possibly to prevent anyone from uncovering the human remains buried there. On the morning of the 14th of December 1952, Christie strangled his wife in bed. She had been last seen in public 2 days earlier. Christie invented several stories to explain his wife's disappearance and to help migrate the possibility of further inquiries being made. In reply to a letter from relatives in Sheffield, he wrote that his wife had rheumatism and could not write by herself. To one neighbour, he explained that she was visiting her relatives in Sheffield. To another, he said that she had gone to Birmingham. Christie had resigned from his job on the 6th of December and had been unemployed since then. To support himself, he sold his wife's wedding ring and watch on the 17th of December for £2 10 and furniture on the 8th of January 1953, for which he received £11. He kept cutlery, 2 chairs, a mattress and his kitchen table. From the 23rd of January to the 20th of March, he received his weekly unemployment benefit of £3 12. On the 26th of January 1953, Christie forged his wife's signature and emptied her bank account. On the 27th of February 1953, Christie sold some of his wife's clothing for £3 5. He also received a cheque for £8 on the 7th of March from the Bradford Clothing and Supply Company. Between the 19th of January and the 6th of March 1953, Christie murdered 3 more women he invited back to 10 Rillington Place: Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson and Hectorina McLennan. Nelson was from Belfast and was visiting her sister in Ladbroke Grove. She was 6 months pregnant at the time she encountered Christie. Christie first met McLennan, who was living in London with her boyfriend Alex Baker, in a cafe. All 3 met on several occasions, and after this, Christie let McLennan and Baker stay at Rillington Place while they were looking for accommodation. On another occasion, Christie met McLennan on her own and persuaded her to come back to his flat where he murdered her. Later, he convinced Baker, who had come to Rillington Place looking for McLennan, that he had not seen her. Christie kept up the presence for several days, meeting Baker regularly to see if he'd had news of McLennan's whereabouts and to help him search for her. For the murders of his final 3 victims, Christie modified the gassing technique he had first used on Edie. He used a rubber tube connected to a gas pipe in the kitchen, which he kept closed off with a bulldog clip. He seated his victims in the kitchen, released the clip on the tube and let the gas leak into the room. The Barabin report pointed out that Christie's explanation of his gassing technique was not satisfactory because he would have been overpowered by the gas as well. It established that all 3 victims had been exposed to carbon monoxide. The gas made the victims drowsy, after which Christie strangled them with a length of rope. As with Edie, Christie repeatedly hour-worded his last 3 victims while they were unconscious and continued to do so as they died. When this aspect of his crimes was publicly revealed, Christie quickly gained a reputation as being a necrophiliac. One commentator was cautioned against categorising Christie as such. According to the accounts he gave to the police, he did not engage sexually with any of his victims exclusively after death. After Christie had murdered each of his final victims by ligature strangulation, he placed a vest or small cloth-like material between their legs, wrapping their semi-naked body in blankets, in a similar manner to the way in which Beryl's body had been wrapped, then stowing the bodies in a small alcove behind the back kitchen wall. He later covered the entrance to this alcove with wallpaper. Christie moved out of 10 Rillington Place on the 20th of March 1953 after fraudulently subletting his flat to a couple from whom he took £7 13. The landlord visited the same evening and, finding the couple there instead of Christie, demanded that they leave the first thing in the morning. The landlord allowed the tenant of the top-floor flat, Beresford Brown, to use Christie's kitchen. On the 24th of March, Brown discovered the kitchen alcove when he attempted to insert brackets into the wall to hold a wireless set. Peeling back the wallpaper, Brown saw the bodies of Maloney, Nelson and McLennan. After getting confirmation from another tenant in Rillington Place that they were dead bodies, Brown informed the police and a citywide search for Christie began. After leaving Rillington Place, Christie had gone to Rowton House in King's Cross and booked a room for 7 nights under his real name and address. He stayed there for only 4 nights, leaving on the 24th of March when the news broke of the discovery of his flat. Christie wandered around London, slept rough, and spent much of the day in cafes and cinemas. On the 28th of March, he pawned his watch in Battersea for 10 shillings. On the morning of the 31st of March, Christie was arrested on the embankment near Putney Bridge after being challenged about his identity by a police officer, P.C. Thomas Ledger. When the police searched Christie, they discovered an old newspaper clipping about the remand of Timothy Evans among the personal items on him. Christie initially admitted only to the murders of the women in the alcove and his wife during the police questioning. When informed about the skeletons buried in the back garden, he admitted responsibility for their deaths as well. On the 27th of April 1953, he confessed to the murder of Beryl Evans, which Timothy Evans had originally been charged during the police investigation in 1949, although for most part he denied killing Geraldine. On one occasion following his trial, Christie indicated that he may have been responsible for her death as well, having said so to a hospital orderly. It is speculated that Christie would not have wanted to readily admit his guilt in Geraldine's death in order to alienate the jury from his desire to not be found guilty by reason of insanity and for his safety from fellow inmates. On the 5th of June 1953, Christie confessed to the murders of Edie and First, which helped the police identify the skeletons. Christie was tried only for the murder of his wife. His trial began on the 22nd of June 1953 in the same court in which Evans had been tried 3 years earlier. Christie pleaded insanity, with his defence describing him as mad as March hare, and claimed to have poor memory of the events. Dr. Matheson, a doctor at HM Prison Brixton who evaluated Christie, was called as a witness by the prosecution. He testified using medical terminology of the time that Christie had a hysterical personality but was not insane. The jury rejected Christie's plea and after deliberating for 85 minutes found him guilty. He was sentenced to death by Mr. Justice Finnemore. On the 29th of June 1953, Christie stated that he would not be making an appeal against his conviction. On the 2nd of July, Evans's mother wrote to Christie asking him to confess all. On the 8th of July 1953, MP George Rogers interviewed Christie for 45 minutes about the murders. The following day, Christie spoke to the Scott Anderson inquiry about the murders. 4 days later, the Home Secretary, David Maxwell Fyfe, said that he could not find any grounds medically or psychologically for Christie to be reprieved. Among Christie's final visitors while in the condemned cell were an ex-army friend, Dennis Haig, on the 13th of July, the prison governor and Christie's sister, Phyllis Clark, who both visited him on the night before his execution. George Rogers also wanted to speak to Christie for a second time on the night before his execution, but Christie refused to meet him again. According to both Haig and Clark, Christie appeared resigned towards his death. Christie was hanged at 9 a.m. on the 15th of July 1953 at HM Prison, Pentonville. His execution was Albert Pierpoint, who had hanged Evans. After being pinioned for execution, Christie complained that his nose itched. Pierpoint assured him that it won't bother you for long. After the execution, Christie's body was buried in an unmarked grave within the precincts of the prison, as was standard practice for executed prisoners in the United Kingdom. Following Christie's conviction, there was substantial controversy concerning the earlier trial of Timothy Evans, who had been convicted mainly on the evidence of Christie, who lived in the same property in which Evans had allegedly carried out his crimes. Christie confessed to Beryl's murder, and although he neither confessed to nor was charged with Geraldine's murder, he was widely considered guilty for both murders. This cast doubt on the fairness of Evans's trial and raised the possibility that an innocent person had been hanged. The controversy prompted the Home Secretary David Maxwell Fyfe to commission an inquiry led by John Scott Henderson, QC, the Recorder of Portsmouth, to determine whether Evans had been innocent and a miscarriage of justice had occurred. Henderson interviewed Christie before his execution as well as another 20 witnesses who had been involved in either of the police investigations. He concluded that Evans was in fact guilty of both murders and that Christie's confessions of the murder of Beryl were unreliable and made in the context of furthering his own defence that he was insane. Far from ending the matter, questions continued to be raised in Parliament concerning Evans's innocence, parallel with the newspaper campaigns and books being published making similar claims. The Henderson inquiry was criticised for being held over too short a period of time and for being prejudiced against the possibility that Evans was innocent. This controversy, along with the coincidence that two stranglers would have been living in the same property at the same time if Evans and Christie had both been guilty, kept alive concerns that a miscarriage of justice has occurred in Evans's trial. This uncertainty led to a second inquiry chaired by High Court Judge Sir Daniel Brabin, which was conducted over the winter of 1965 to 1966. Brabin re-examined much of the evidence from both cases and evaluated some of the arguments for Evans's innocence. His conclusions were that it was more probable than not that Evans had killed his wife but not his daughter Geraldine, for whose death Christie was responsible. Christie's likely motive was that her presence would have drawn attention to Beryl's disappearance, which Christie would have been adverse to, as it increased the risk of his own murders being uncovered. Brabham also noted that the uncertainty involved in the case would have prevented the jury from being satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that Evans's guilt had he been retried. The conclusions were used by the Home Secretary Roy Jenkins to recommend a posthumous pardon for Evans, which was granted, as he had been tried and executed for the murder of his daughter. Jenkins announced the granting of Evans' pardon to the House of Commons on the 18th of October 1966. Evans's remains were subsequently exhumed and returned to his family, who arranged for him to be reburied in a private grave. There was already a debate in the United Kingdom over the judicial killing. Evans's execution and other controversial cases contributed to the 1965 suspension and subsequent abolition of capital punishment in the UK. In January 2003, the Home Office awarded Evans's half-sister Mary Westlake and his sister Eileen Ashby payments as compensation for the miscarriage of justice in his trial. The independent assessor for the Home Office, Lord Brennan QC, accepted that the conviction and execution of Timothy Evans for the murder of his child was wrongful and a miscarriage of justice, and that there is no evidence to implicate Timothy Evans in the murder of his wife. She was most probably murdered by Christie. Lord Brennan believed that the Brabham report's conclusion that Evans probably murdered his wife should be rejected given Christie's confession and conviction.